Firstly, so thank you very much for inviting me here today. This workshop, as you outlined, has had a very long history, and so I'm delighted to be able to be presenting my paper today, which is called "The Wars We Think We Are Fighting: The Social Imaginary, Brexit, and Violent Masculinities." I like to call this paper my lockdown paper because it was a paper that was written while I was watching the rather crazy intersection of Brexit, COVID-19, and specifically a bevy of white male politicians led by Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, and many others as they bumbled and fumbled their way through trying to deal with this crisis, all the while trying to convince us that they were still the strong men in charge. And so this is very much the backdrop of the paper that I would like to present today. I'm going to essentially presenting a bit of a polemic. It'll be a slightly different paper to what I normally present. I won't really be posing any grand solutions to the problems of violent masculinity, but rather, as I said, presenting a polemic, laying out a range of ideas for discussion and provocation. And I hope that it'll provide some backdrop to some of the case studies that we're going to hear from, although I think that they might be a lot more specific than some of the arguments I'm going to be making. What we know is that in Europe today, as it faces economic uncertainty and potential disintegration through processes like Brexit and the so-called migrant crisis, the resurgence of traditional gender roles can be seen in a whole range of different ways. No longer in most of Europe are men called on to fight in the traditional sense of going to war, but rather the conservative push across the West beckons men once again to protect their countries from hostile outsiders. The zeitgeist and the political mood is essentially to pull up the drawbridge. In the UK, this is often captured by the idea of Fortress Britain. This time, it's not really to stop the Nazi invaders, well, it's not to stop the Nazi invaders, but rather the unwelcome migrants and refugees, along with a bunch of EU bureaucrats who might want to regulate ordinary life. In this new order, and at the very least for those of us who live in Europe, we can demonstrate our patriotism at the ballot box by putting our cross next to a far right-leaning political party that will promise us security and stringent border controls and a security mindset. Men of a liberal persuasion like myself, who have maybe a less hostile view of the immigration, are now called beaters and libtards and tolerant soy boys and snowflakes. This type of belittling now permeates the political system at many levels. In recent parliamentary debate, Boris Johnson was overheard referring to Jeremy Corbyn as a big girl's blouse, and we've continued to hear of Ramonas with headlines such as "Stop crying, Ramonas, there's never been a better time to be British." It goes without saying that Donald Trump has used this idea and the emasculating language in numerous occasions, and I won't repeat some of it. Such gendered insults, of course, are not new, and we saw them during the negotiation process in Northern Ireland, where the Women's Coalition, for example, were routinely referred to as stupid women, as traitors, and Ian Paisley Jr. famously at one moment actually started to moo when one of the members of the Women's Coalition spoke. This type of behavior can be tracked back but throughout history. But what is currently taking place in Europe and the US, I would hesitate to say, is not merely more of the same. What is interesting about the current anti-feminist sentiment and the intensification of right-wing politics and the attempts to reassert a certain type of traditional masculinity is that it's happening in a time when Europe has probably pushed the strongest against conservative values. An anti-feminist response to the equality agenda is not really just an add-on to the far-right trend. And numerous feminists have written about this, from Cynthia Enloe to others, saying that this is increasingly a core part of this type of an ideology. This article will not, however, investigate, or this talk will not, investigate the link between extremism and anti-feminist discourse. Rather, I want to explore why changes in gender relations and the pervasive nature of violent and toxic masculinities, often bound into this far right-wing surge, have proved so durable and difficult to change. The core of my argument is that the change in gender relations and violent masculinities and toxic masculinities is slow and painful, not only because of the structural impediments of change, such as the pervasive grip that men still have in the economy and in the home, but also because of the failure to create a new gender social imaginary. Like many concepts, the social imaginary is rather wide. It is used in many different ways, and in its simplest form, and drawing from the introduction to the journal Social Imaginaries in 2015, we can think of social imaginaries as they highlight the phenomenon of collectively instituted meaning. They're the constitutive elements of socio-cultural reality. As Adams and others have said, it is the cultural articulations of the world. The social imaginary is significant, as Peter Wagner argues, as we to see how people interpret the world at any given time and a basis for developing a sound understanding of the present that in turn may help to change the world. The concept of the social imaginary also directs us towards thinking about power, as well as about ideas and beliefs and how they're represented, particularly within the area of the symbolic in our language, in our stories, and in our myths. Different representations often create, regardless of their content, different types of emotive power, but they also link in with other types of institutional power. Such symbols resonate with much bigger ideas. Consider the juxtaposition implied by the snowflake generation compared to the so-called greatest generation, those born in the 1920s who fought in World War II. During COVID, I've also been keeping a little bit of a diary, documenting the number of times the Second World War is used as a way of trying to spur people on to follow the regulations, that we're fighting this virus, that we need to bring back the spirit of Dunkirk to conquer it. There are numerous occasions throughout the British media that this trope is played over and over again. But if we go back to the issue of power, take the question of the greatest generation. Despite their real sacrifices, many certainly made in the world wars, and their resilience and the bravery in many cases, this is also the same generation that laid the foundation for staggering inequality, actually enforced racial segregation, oversaw the collapse of major industries, and paved the way for the destruction of our planet. However, saying this is enough in some circles to get thrown out of the room, or in this case, to have the Zoom suddenly turned off. In other words, although the myth of the greatest generation can be inspiring and a rallying call to action, other parts of its effects are really silencing, shaming, disempowering, and hiding the social and racial injustices and the violence of Western democracy. Such an imagery essentially preserves the status quo rather than changes societies. There are a range of debates around the social imaginary, and I'm not going to go into them all, but I want to just raise one small one. Well, it's quite a big one, but raise it very briefly. There is a risk, says Castoriadis, that with this type of thinking of the social imaginary, that society is transformed into a subject in a sort of literal and metaphoric sense. He therefore rejects the idea that the social imaginary can ever be reduced or understood through individual imagery. In contrast, Claudius Strauss rejects this conceptualization and tends and argues that Castoriadis basically seeks a unifying concept of the social imaginary that would sort of jump across different parts of history. Strauss argues much more for a person-centered approach to the imaginary, noting that it is people that essentially imagine, and it is only through studying real people that the tendency to see imaginaries as homogeneous or fixed can be challenged. A person-centered approach to imaginary is useful in that it opens the door for a much more nuanced understanding of society. And in feminist scholarship and scholarship around masculinities, we've seen multiple studies doing this, a much more person-centered ethnography. I'm thinking here of Kimberly Theiden's work on Colombia, where she talks about the variations of the types of masculinities expressed beyond the monolithic idea of the paramilitary or the guerrilla. In the DRC, Bars and Stern have also written about men, and note, for example, that men do not only aspire to the iconic idealized soldier, but also seek the desk job in the military to do management or administration, as this opens the door to a certain type of urban lifestyle and to be a provider of women. This type of thinking, and has also looked at variations within rape in wartime, has often now been referred to as variation theory and calls for a much more nuanced understanding of masculinities. Understanding the variations in masculinities is crucial, as it reinforces the idea that masculinities are not inherently more gender equitable or alternative or progressive, as Walker reminds us in South Africa, but generally ambivalent and embryonic and vying for different types of space and expression. A dominant argument that flows from this, that I've used a lot in my own work, is that one of the ways to challenge violent masculinities is to accentuate this difference, to accentuate this type of contestation and articulate the multiple voices in this people-centered approach. To get to grips with the people-centered approach, we need to place it, however, in a much broader a matrix of social power, competing narratives, myths, and stories. And this is where, for me, the social imaginary starts to come into play. What we know about the social imaginary, however, is that it is also not static. It is continually adapting and is continually changing. Take the military, for example. Now the idea of the compassionate soldier is much more on the table than it ever has been before. Yet many of us still in our writing and in our thinking about the world see such institutions like the military in a very one-dimensional way. But it too is reacting and creating an ever-changing complexity of imaginary. This is evidenced recently in the latest British Army recruitment campaign aimed at so-called Generation Z, youngsters between the age of 16 and 25 years old. As you can see from the poster, from the PowerPoint, some interesting slogans. Snowflakes, your army needs you and your compassion. Me, millennial, your army needs you and your self-belief. Phone zombies, your army needs you and your focus. This campaign literally insults millennials, but recognizes a change in society at the same time. But all the while, it's also maintaining the essence of masculine power through harking back to the recruitment poster of old, of Lord Kitchener during the First World War. Your country needs you. I should add, by the way, that this campaign was deemed to be incredibly successful in its recruitment. The question is, therefore, not just how to prevent violent masculinities manifesting through the actions of individuals or groups of men or women, but also to stop pervasive masculinities that marginalize them and stop pervasive masculinities that marginalize the poor, but also to consider how hidden masculinities and cultures and imaginaries operate in a whole range of different hierarchies and social spaces. The power of the symbolic is important here. And it's only more recently in my work that I've begun to explore some of this element of the symbolic. Take, for example, the classic Marlborough Man or the Camel Man. These are images which stick with many of us of a certain generation, but now alt-right symbols like Pepe, the Nazi frog, and the Moon Man, to mention a few, not to mention the rather creative insults thrown at liberals that I mentioned before, all have a massive symbolic power. If we think of the Brexit debate in itself, it was laden and filled with invented symbolism. For example, the alleged EU ban on bendy bananas, the regulation and fictitious banning of prawn cocktail crisps, the invented claim that the EU actually required toys for farmed pigs to improve their mental health, fictitious rumors that the Bombay mix was soon to be renamed Mumbai mix to satisfy those of us of a politically correct disposition, and an alleged EU regulation that actually specified what the standard size of a coffin had to be. Most damaging of these, of course, are the much more active and direct forms of symbolism. For example, the UKIP poster featuring a large group of refugees under the banner of Breaking Point. And of course, we all cannot forget Make America Great and take back control of the Brexit campaign. When it comes to the issue of masculinities and the resistance to alternative masculinities, which has now become tied into these right-wing discourses, as I mentioned in the beginning, I would argue that what is going on here is also a failure of the imaginary. For many on the peace building and transitional justice field, our imaginary of war and peace is limited by our very violence-centric perspective, and our solutions to problems are equally curtailed by the limits of what we think this idealized and generally normative response should be, not to mention some limited understandings of men in general. One example of this is the solutions that are often posed towards toxic masculinities and violent masculinities. This often seeks to replace these with new emotionally enlightened masculinities. To deal with the social changes in the world, men, or so the popular argument goes, or the imaginary so prominent in Western individualism commands us, we need to recognize our pain and the impact of emotion and even the physical damage caused by certain types of masculinities, and then reform. Like the cosmopolitan magazine feminist, the new man needs to be everything, in touch with their emotions, share household chores, equitable and non-violent, and less in self-defense and protecting the home, of course, not to mention finding the time to be immaculately groomed. Such imaginaries are so powerful that they even cross borders. And there is an interesting argument going on in South Africa, led by Morel and others, which look at the way some black men have adopted this type of an approach to masculinities. So my core argument is that the amplification of multiple masculinities can be vital as one strategy for trying to deal with violent masculinities. Changes in power structures, of course, are also needed, especially to reshape masculinities, but also a more intangible process of change in the broader social imaginary also needs to take place if masculinities are to evolve and change. But exactly how this happens is difficult to grasp. We know, and that we've seen in different epochs and moments of history, collective understandings of society have changed profoundly. The rise of religion, Marxism, arguably the rise of neoliberalism, they've shaken society to the core, but it is challenging to adequately describe how such changes came about. And we tend to fall back on making arguments which are only about material conditions. Such changes were ushered in along with a radical reimagining. The bigger question is therefore, how do we shape our wider social imaginary? What is the social imaginary of a more equitable and inclusive gender relations? Can we even reimagine masculinity? Should we? By way of conclusion, before that, that's my hairdresser, and you can see advertising the need for a haircut for a real man, which I'm long overdue. So, by way of conclusion, Castoriadis reminds us that we cannot ignore the imaginary, as it is the root of alienation as well as the creation of history. Arguably across Europe today, a new imaginary is in the making, and this is intrinsically linked to the fading time of the great catastrophes of World War I and World War II in Europe. The interesting point to consider is whether the upheaval we see in the imaginary of the masculine and the different conceptualizations of it is the beginning of something new or the death throes of something old, or just more of the same. In the maelstrom of the Brexit referendum, when the choice was starkly between the EU and Brexit, we saw a limiting of the aspirations of politics rather than widening. On the one hand, we had Brexiteers reinforcing the imagery of Empire 2.0 and Britain rebooting itself to allegedly become great again. Yet on the other hand, for those of us opposed to Brexit, we could not really see past the EU. In terms of masculinities, the failure is equally evident in the victimhood many men now claim on the one hand, and the failure of imagination when we resort to normative arguments about what masculinity should or ought to be in response, or simply expect everyone to fall into line because it is the right thing to do, otherwise we'll shame you into some sort of change. Even the term backlash, when applied to the anti-feminist agenda, which I have routinely used myself in my own work, implies things were entirely on track, and we knew exactly where that track was leading, when in fact we did not. We treat gender, the most fluid of imaginaries, as a linear, progressive process and something that can be altered through social reorganization and technocratic and legal processes. This mirrors the type of rational and technocratic debates that have dominated the peace-building literature for decades. Yet those of us who work in the field with governments and communities know that a positive peace is not made through the law or in the boardroom or at the negotiation table or in the therapy room or in the community workshop because everybody does the right thing and makes some rational, calculated choice. Peace is made when people see, both practically and in an imagined idea of the future, that peace is worth making, and it resonates with a societal meaning that is not merely logical. However, our response to violent masculinities in the right wing, particularly for those of us in the liberal academia, I would argue lacks imagination. Many of us, seeking an alternative to the growth of the right-wing populism, remained in the quagmire, sometimes of self-righteousness, espousing a limited repertoire of responses that cannot be disputed. All we really can offer to diffuse this right-wing, radical, violent masculinity is and the anti-feminist sentiment is individualized de-radicalization workshops and other types of normative solutions in terms of law, equality, liberal democracy, and so on. To be sure, history is not ended, as Fukuyama tries to get us to believe, but the imagination of the future, particularly when it comes to masculinities, for me is decidedly unremarkable. To move beyond this, our very notion of peace and political institutions like the EU and liberal democracy in itself, and of course gender relations, require a much more creative reimagining. Thank you very much.